Getting on to Amundsen, as I say, Norway's greatest hero. He was the very first person to discover a route through the Northwest Passage, the first to reach the South Pole, the first person, in fact, to reach both poles, the North Pole and the South Pole. He was first to fly a plane above the Arctic Circle, and he was the preeminent explorer in what was known as the heroic age of polar exploration. He was born on the 16th of July, 1872 in Bourget here in Norway. He was the fourth son of a steamship family. And they're a happy-looking bunch, aren't they? I've actually looked through hundreds and hundreds of photos of Amundsen. If you can find one where he's actually smiling, you do better than I am. There is nothing out there. But yeah, his father, his three brothers, his uncles and his cousins all went into shipping. Most of them became ship's captains, and he wanted nothing more than to follow in those footsteps and become a sea captain himself. But his mother insisted that she wanted a doctor in the family, and the younger son was going to be that doctor. So he was forced to stay in school and then go to university and medical college. But when he was 21 years old, his mother passed away, and he immediately dropped out of medical school, and he wanted to go away, not just have a career at sea. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of his new hero. And that man was a man by the name of Fridtjof Nansen. Now, to do justice to Nansen, I would need another 45 minutes to do a presentation into him. Another Norwegian hero, but a real hero for the whole world, in fact. He was a 12 times cross-country ski champion for Norway, and he became the very first person to cross Greenland. Now, back in those days, the idea of going to the North Pole seemed extremely difficult. People would try and build up to that by crossing Greenland. It had been attempted many, many times, and all of the people who had attempted it had started off on the west coast, which is populated, and they tried to make their way to the east coast. Robert Peary, the great American polar adventurer, had held the record for getting furthest, but that was only 160 miles into the interior of Greenland before he was forced to turn back, and his attempt had been unsuccessful. And that was less than 10% of the entire journey. But Nansen decided on a new tactic. He went to the east coast of Greenland. He burnt the ship that he had taken there, so now he had to make it across because there was no other way. He had no other choice. And he and his companions made it across all the way across Greenland in only 49 days. And they were using skis. Now, every Norwegian child growing up, as soon as you can walk, you're given a pair of skis. But back in those days, skis around the rest of the world were just pretty much a novelty. They were used for a bit of fun in ski season, but that was all. They weren't usually used for cross-country skiing or anything. And Nansen proved the effectiveness of these skis. He returned back to Christiania, which was the capital of Norway at that time, present-day Oslo, on the 30th of May in 1889. And he was such a hero that 40,000 people came out to greet him, which was 1/3 of the population of Christiania at that time. And one of the people that came down to see this great hero return to Norway was a 17-year-old schoolboy by the name of Roald Amundsen. And Nansen became his hero. Now, at the time, Norway was the junior partner in a union between Sweden and Norway. The Swedish king was also the king of Norway. But there was a lot of agitation in Norway at that time for them to become independent. A lot of people campaigning for that. And Nansen, who was very pro-Norwegian, became the focal point of those independence movements. In 1893, he decided on a quest to get to the North Pole. He designed and built a ship specifically for this purpose, which he called the Fram. And the idea was to sail the Fram into an Arctic ice pack, become embedded in the ice, and use the currents of the northern oceans to take him up as close to the North Pole as possible. Now, they got to a point where it's 84.4 degrees north, remembering that the North Pole is 90 degrees north, and that was at that time the furthest that a ship had ever been. But they still had 356 nautical miles to go. So Nansen and a companion attempted to get to the North Pole, taking a sled with them. Now, long story short, I can't really go into it in detail, but they got to the point where they went so far north there was no food that they could obtain, so they had tried to make a return. They had to endure a very harsh winter in the ice. They built a hut to stay in, and they were only saved when they came across a British expedition. Now, everyone had given him up for dead, so when he returned back to Norway again, he was once again a national hero, and he became the mentor for young Roald Amundsen. They became good friends, and Nansen supported Amundsen in his quest to be a great explorer, both with information, support, and also financial support as well. Now, Nansen went on, he met after World War I, he met a family of refugees, and he became concerned about the plight of refugees. So he became the very first advocate in the world at that time for refugees after World War I. There was millions of displaced people all around Europe at that time. He worked through the League of Nations as their first advocate to support these people, and they eventually were issued with what were known as Nansen passports. And these people had lost everything. They didn't have passports of their own. These passports were recognised by more than 50 countries around the world, and these refugees were able to find sanctuary at places like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries as well. He also arranged for relief during the Russian famine. And this was a time where millions of people in Russia were starving to death, and it's believed that he saved hundreds of thousands of people with the relief that he organised and sent to Russia. He was awarded the 1922 Nobel Peace Prize, and the organisation he set up to support refugees also won the Nobel Prize in 1938, 8 years after he passed away. The Nansen Refugee Award is still recognised today as the most prestigious award for supporters or advocates of refugees around the world. When he died in 1930, every school in Oslo or Christiania at that time, every school, every business in the city closed down, and it's believed that the entire city came to pay their respects to their greatest national hero at that time. Now, in the meantime, Amundsen himself wanted to model himself on Nansen. He threw himself into his studies to become a master mariner, and he passed his qualifications for mate in 1896. He sent out letters to anyone who announced that they were sending out an expedition to anywhere in the world. And finally, a Belgian expedition accepted him to go on an expedition down to Antarctica. And this was an expedition where Belgium at that time had colonised a lot of regions of Africa, and they were thinking that this new continent to the south, there might be opportunities for us to colonise there as well, or have some land down there. So this expedition was going to be sent down there to map most of Antarctica, and so that the Belgians would have an opportunity to claim some of it. Now, it was an international crew, and Amundsen was only allowed to go or accepted the post as first officer on the condition that he received no pay at all. He just wanted to go on an adventure, on an expedition. Now, one of the people he met on this expedition was an American doctor by the name of Frederick Cook, who had some experience. He was one of the only people on board that had any experience in Arctic conditions. Dr. Cook he was way ahead of his time. He had spent a lot of time with the Inuit people in Canada and also in Greenland, and he had learnt from them. He had seen that they didn't suffer from the same illnesses or maladies as the Europeans seemed to do, including things like scurvy. And he studied them, and he put it all down to their diet of fresh meat, including seal meat, and especially the internal organs of the seals, the offal within those seals. And he was one of the first people to suggest that if you ate this fresh meat, you wouldn't suffer from scurvy. Now, while they were there, Amundsen was the very first person to ski in Antarctica. And while they were out skiing, he and Cook used to go out to try and hunt for seal. And while they did this, Amundsen realised that he could get about much more efficiently and faster using his skis than Cook could, even though Cook was experienced in these conditions in boots or snowshoes, and he kept that in the back of his mind as well. Now, the ship had gone down to Antarctica too late within the season to do much in the way of mapping. So the captain of the ship deliberately drove it into an ice barrier, and they became trapped in that ice. His idea was, we'll spend the winter down here. When the ice melts again, we'll go and do the rest of the mapping of Antarctica. But the crew had no intention of doing this that wasn't what they signed up for. They had no clue that the captain was planning to do this. So they tried to mutiny, but there was absolutely nowhere for them to go. They had to endure a very bleak, cold winter in Antarctica in complete darkness for 3.5 months, minus 60 degrees often, and fierce, more than 100-mile-an-hour winds on occasions as well. Some of the men who refused to eat the fresh meat that Cook and Amundsen had gone out and hunted for them started to contract scurvy. In fact, half the crew came down with scurvy. One man committed suicide, and 2 other men went insane. So when spring did come and the ship came out of the ice, and the mutiny was in the air, the captain had no choice. They had to abandon the expedition, and everyone made their own ways home. But it had given Amundsen a little bit of experience in those sorts of conditions, and it had given him the worst experience possible in how to manage and lead an expedition. So he said, if I'm going to command an expedition of my own someday, it's all going to come down to very precise preparation and planning. He needed men who had skills in that region and who knew what they were signing up for and could spend long periods of time under those conditions, and they would also need fresh food. He came back to Norway and he did his national service, and he really enjoyed this time as well, because a lot of that national service was going out into the wilderness and learning survival techniques in the harsh Norwegian winter wilderness. And then he achieved his examinations, he passed the examinations to become a master mariner, so he could command any Norwegian ship at sea. But it was a role that he never actually took up. Now, the Northwest Passage. Europeans had been obsessed with the Northwest Passage for more than 400 years. It was a route, the only 2 sea routes available to Europeans to get to Asia, for example, were either all the way down the Atlantic and under the bottom of South Africa, and then all the way across the Indian Ocean, or all the way down the Atlantic again, through the Straits of Magellan, and all the way across the Pacific. There was 12,000 miles of travel, and over the years, hundreds of ships were lost to the sea forever. There had to be a better way, and it was thought that if there was a way under the bottom of South America, surely there's a way across the top of it to the northwest of Europe, a Northwest Passage. And over the years, dozens of the greatest names in exploration went searching for the Northwest Passage. Henry Hudson, he sailed into a river thinking this might be the entrance to the passage. That river is now named after him and, of course, is where New York is located. A couple of years later, he was sailed further north and he went into a bay which is also named in his honour, Hudson Bay, and he thought he had found the Northwest Passage. When he wanted to continue after a very harsh winter, his crew mutinied. They cast him adrift in a longboat with his 8-year-old son and 7 other sailors, and Henry Hudson was never seen again. But the great French explorer Jacques Cartier, on the Feast of St. Lawrence Day, he sailed into a river as well, thinking this might be the entrance to the Northwest Passage. He sailed all the way up to where present-day Montreal is now, only to discover that he couldn't go any further. And in 1845, Sir John Franklin and 129 men went searching for the Northwest Passage, and they all perished in the attempt. Now, the motivation for finding the Northwest Passage became redundant in 1869 with the opening of the Suez Canal. But because of the cost of the men and the honour of finding the Northwest Passage, it was still thought to be a very noble cause to try and this Northwest Passage, to show that these men hadn't all died in vain. But there had to also, that was a noble reason, wasn't going to allow people to fund them, including scientific organisations like geographical societies. So Amundsen had to come up with a reason, a scientific reason, to go and search for the Northwest Passage. And he came up with one, because in 1823, Sir James Clark Ross, a great British explorer, had become the first person to reach the magnetic North Pole, which is in a different location to the geographical North Pole. Now, Ross surmised, he had a theory that the magnetic North Pole, which is where all our compasses point to, was not static. It would move about. Which was against all the theories of that time. And because it would move around, the charts over the years would have to be adjusted. Now, once again, that was scoffed at by scientists at that time. But Amundsen proposed that he would try and go to where Ross had discovered the magnetic North Pole, and then go to where the magnetic North Pole was now to see whether there was any change. And he was actually given some funding by the Norwegian Geographical Society. Before he decided to go, he went further north in Norway to Tromsø to do some work with the whaling and the sealing fleets up there, to try and get experience in Arctic waters. Now, the men of Tromsø back in those days were very isolated and mistrustful of any outsiders, including their southern counterparts from southern Norway. And Amundsen had to work very hard to earn the respect of these fishermen, these sealers and whalers. But eventually he gained a lot of skills through them. They taught him about what sort of vessels would be best for searching for in these Arctic waters, the design of ships, for example. And he was actually able to buy a vessel called the Joa, which was 21 metres or about 60 feet long, ideal for these sort of conditions. But he actually leased out the Joa to the most experienced captain and whaling crew, sealing crew that he could find, on the provision that he could go along with them and learn from these men. And this was a masterclass in sailing through Arctic waters. Later he installed a small motor on board, a 13 horsepower motor with just paraffin, so he could manoeuvre through the ice if necessary. And he and Nansen, who was also a scientist, developed a new type of jerky or dried meat called pemmican. Now, pemmican is very, very high in fats and also in calories, which is ideal if you're working hard in these very, very cold climates. So instead of having to stop and set up a stove and cook your food, this is things that you can just eat as you're going, making it very viable for them. The other thing he learnt while he was in Tromsø was about dog sledding. He met people who used dog sleds to haul their goods from place to place. And he was told by these people that this would be the ideal thing to be able to carry large or pull large amounts of supplies for any other expedition. And he liked the idea of these dog sleds. He recruited a crew of 6 men, and he made sure all of these men had experience in Arctic conditions. They all had different skills. There was one man who was a world championship skier. There was another man who was an engineer to take care of the motor. There was another man who was expert in hunting on the ice. All of these people had particular skills, but they all came. Part of the reason they got together was they would all multi-skill and learn each other's skills as well. Now, Nansen had gone to the King of Sweden, King Oscar, and asked him for support for this expedition from Amundsen. And King Oscar eventually agreed to donate 10,000 krona. Now, this was quite controversial in Sweden at that time because the Swedes resented the fact that these Norwegians wanted independence from Sweden. So for the King of Sweden to give this 10,000 krona was very controversial in Sweden, but it also ensured that once it had been received, Amundsen was able to receive other support, financial support from sponsors in Norway as well. Now, they left in June 1903 in search of the Northwest Passage, and they sailed across to Beechy Island in the northern regions of Canada. And when they got there, they realised that the position that Ross had calculated as the magnetic North Pole was south of them, and the point that their compasses were pointing at now, where magnetic north was to the southwest of where they were. So they sailed south down further, and they reached the spot where Ross had calculated that the magnetic North Pole was. But their compass, there's this stage, was pointing north now. So he knew that the magnetic North Pole was actually moving. They found a little bay as winter was approaching, and they thought they'd spend the winter there because they might not find anywhere better. And they called this Joa Haven, and it's still called Joa Haven today. It is the largest settlement in that northern area of Canada. And this was a very good place. It was well protected, but most importantly, what they found to their surprise, it was also on the caribou migration route. So they could just sit on their ship, the Joa, and fire their rifles at these caribou, and they had an ample supply of fresh meat. Now, those gunshots were heard by Inuit who were also travelling behind the caribou as part of their food chain as well. And an Inuit family came to investigate the gunshots, and they got on very well with Amundsen and his crew. Now, they traded with them. Amundsen gave them things like axes and kettles and knives and things, and also metal needles, because the Inuit only had bone needles, which often broke. And the Inuit, in return, they schooled Amundsen and his men in how to survive in the Arctic. They were locked in the ice for 2 years in Joa Haven. They didn't need to be. They could have sailed out that first spring. But Amundsen decided to stay there because he was learning so much from the Inuit, including how to make igloos and things. Now, igloos are made obviously out of ice, and ice is made up of water and air. Air is very important. Air is the best insulator that you can have. So when you make an igloo and you've got all that air trapped in the ice there, where it might be minus 40 degrees outside, inside that igloo it might be a nice balmy minus 3 or 4 degrees. It's tropical. But they also taught him other skills, including dog sledding, all about dog sledding. The Norwegians had a system at the time where they just had 7 different runners going out from their sled, and the dogs would just go off that way, fanned out. Where the Inuit used teams of dog sleds in a row, and they showed them how to put the dogs in position. Which dog would be the ideal lead dog, which dogs were the strongest and should be at the back because they're pulling most of the weight of the sled. And Amundsen and his men became very, very proficient in dog sledding. They also learnt that these dogs were cannibalistic. One of the dogs died one day. He wasn't going to move, so they shot it. They butchered it, and they fed the meat to the other dogs. So these dogs were able to survive by eating other of the huskies. And that was going to be helpful for Amundsen later on down the track. But also the clothing that the Inuit wore. Now, back in those days, European explorers, Arctic explorers, polar explorers, they would wear layers and layers and layers of clothes. First of all, you'd have cotton on, layers of cotton, then you might have wool, and then over the top you might have oilskins. Very, very heavy clothing, very uncomfortable to wear. If you perspired them, if you were working hard and you perspired in them, the moisture wouldn't leave your body and would lead to frostbite. But these caribou furs and reindeer fur, this was different. Every fibre of caribou and reindeer fur, once again, has pockets of air in it. So once again, a great insulator. So while it's very light, it is also extremely warm and protects you from the outside weather as well. So Amundsen made sure that he got enough of these caribou furs for all of his men. He would use that for his later expeditions. Now, while they were there, they were proficient. During the second summer, they used their dog sled skills and their caribou fur skills, and they travelled to where the magnetic North Pole was then, which was down here. So it had moved considerably from where Ross had discovered it all those years before. And as you can see, it's always moving. In 2020, it was up beside the geographic North Pole. So he'd proven that theory of Ross's. Now, they sailed out of Joa Haven after that second spring, and on the 17th of August 1905, they sailed into the Beaufort Sea, becoming the very first people to discover a route through the Northwest Passage. They came across an American whaling vessel, and that American whaling captain came on board, congratulated Amundsen and his men as being the first people to sail through the Northwest Passage. They went to Alaska, and then this is the crew, and they went to Alaska, and then Amundsen skied 500 miles to Eagle, Alaska, which was the closest civilization, to send word back to Norway and the rest of the world of their achievement. Now, when he got there, he'd found out that only a few months before, Norway had achieved their independence from Sweden and were now a sovereign country with their own king. So he sent a telegram to the king, the new king, saying that Norwegians have achieved becoming the first people to sail through the Northwest Passage, and he became the very first hero of the independent country of Norway. And then came the race for the South Pole. Now, while Amundsen was out going through the Northwest Passage, the British had sent an expedition down to Antarctica under the command of Robert Falcon Scott. Another notable man on that expedition was the third officer, Ernest Shackleton. And these men were going to be the other two great explorers of that heroic age of polar expedition. Now, the Discovery Expedition was an expedition financed by the British Royal Geographical Society. It wasn't a naval expedition, but Scott insisted that every man there signed the Royal Navy Discipline Act. So officers had to be saluted and called sir. They had separate eating quarters and sleeping quarters to the enlisted men. It was run like a naval vessel. Now, this was foreign to Shackleton, who had come up through the merchant marine. He was much more relaxed, and he was the most popular officer aboard the Discovery. But he was also quite well regarded at first by Scott, who selected Shackleton and another man by the name of Edward Wilson to go on a sledding expedition to try and get as far south as possible, close to the South Pole. Now, they had no experience whatsoever in these sort of conditions. They wore the clothing and they man-hauled the sledge themselves. They ran out of food quite early, or got short on rations quite early on, and all of the men started suffering from frostbite and also from scurvy. Frostbite and snow blindness. But by far the worst impacted was Shackleton. He also developed scurvy. There were some days where he couldn't pull his own weight. On occasion, he had to lay on the sled while the other men hauled him along. Now, they eventually made it back by the skin of their teeth. And this is a photo of them when they got back. All their faces are black because of the frostbite. Now, Shackleton was sent back to England straight away, while Scott stayed in Antarctica for another year. But when Scott got back to England, he wrote an account of the voyage called The Voyage of the Discovery. And in this book, he is very, very critical of Shackleton, saying that Shackleton was a slacker. He didn't pull his own weight. He had been a burden on that during that sledging expedition, and that he should have, it doesn't say it, but if you read between the lines, it's easy to see. It suggested that Shackleton should have sacrificed his life so that the other two men had a better chance of survival. And this caused a rift between these two explorers for the rest of their lives. But then Shackleton decided that he would take his own expedition down to Antarctica to see whether he could make it to the South Pole. And this was the Nimrod expedition. He set out with 3 other men to try and get to the South Pole. Now, once again, it was a close-run thing. They took 110 days' worth of food because that's all they could carry. And on day 73, they made it to a point where they were only 97 nautical miles away from the South Pole. And Shackleton had to make a decision. He knew he couldn't survive with that much food if he went to the pole and back again. So he decided enough's enough, and they returned back with his men, saving his men. Now, he was criticised by Scott for not making an attempt for on behalf of Britain to become the first people to reach the pole. But then it was Scott's turn again with the Terra Nova expedition of 1911. He was going to take another expedition funded by the Royal Geographical Society to try and make it to the South Pole. In the meantime, Amundsen had announced that he was going to attempt to become the first person to reach the North Pole. So now there was assault on both poles. But Amundsen had prepared meticulously for this expedition to the North Pole. But just before he was about to leave, news came that 2 Americans on separate expeditions had already reached the North Pole. One of them was his old friend, Dr. Frederick Cook, and the other one, Robert Peary. Now, he thought there's no point, there's no honour in being the third man there. What do I do? So his sponsorship, people started asking for their money back because he wasn't going to be the first one to reach the North Pole. Now, over the next few months and years, there was a lot of controversy about these 2 men, Cook and Peary, started arguing about whether the other one actually had made it to the North Pole. They both accused each other of lying about getting there. Cook had said that he'd got there a month before Peary. Peary accused him of lying, and there was lots of accusations going backwards and forwards in the media. It made headlines all around the world about these 2 Americans fighting about who had made it. Now, historians now agree that probably neither of them made it. Cook didn't even get within 100 miles of the North Pole, and Peary, while he got very, very close, probably within 5 miles, his calculations were wrong, his navigational calculations, and he actually never made it to the exact point of the North Pole. But Amundsen didn't know about this at all. He decided secretly that he was going to try and make for the South Pole instead. He left at midnight on 7th of June on 1910. telling everyone that he was still going to the North Pole, but secretly he had decided that he was going to go to the South Pole. He hadn't told anyone apart from the captain of the Fram, which had been lent to him by his old mentor, Nansen. Now, Nansen wasn't even told about this. When they got to the Portuguese territory of Madeira, Amundsen called his men together and said, "We're not going to the North Pole. I want to go to the South Pole. Do you want to come with me? Or if you don't, I'm happy to send you home." And they all voted unanimously to go with him down to the South Pole. So Amundsen had to send letters to Nansen begging his forgiveness for deceiving him and asking him to still support him in this quest, especially amongst the public opinion. And which Nansen did. He also sent letters to the press saying what he was doing, and also to the King of Norway. And he sent a telegram to Scott, who by this time was in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And the telegram just said, "Beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctica, signed Amundsen." And this made Scott furious, because now it was a race to the South Pole. Now, these two people had different ideas about how they would make it to the South Pole. Scott was a bit of a technophobe. He liked the idea of a mechanical version of doing it. So he had developed 3 tractors that he was going to take, and they were going to drag all his supplies all the way to the South Pole and back again. But he must have had a bit of an inkling about whether this would work or not, because at the 11th hour, he sent one of his men to Siberia to buy 8 Siberian ponies, just in case the tractors didn't work. And it turns out that neither of these options were very good options at all, and they had to revert back to the old way, British way of doing it, of man-hauling their sleds. Now, this is a way... This is, if you ever want to lose weight, this is the way to do it. This burns up calorie after calorie after calorie. It is very, very hard work to do. And the other problem with the British expedition was that it was a mixture of science and the quest to get to the South Pole. The scientists on this expedition didn't really care about the South Pole at all, and the people who wanted to get to the pole didn't really care about the science. So Scott himself was torn between the two. He would often make decisions and change that decision within a few minutes. So there was differing priorities here. They were all going to wear European clothing, and most of the men had no experience in these conditions. Whereas Amundsen, he was going to use sled dogs and skis, and he had trained in these and prepared all of his men how to use this equipment. He had one task, and that was to reach the South Pole before anyone else. He wore the Inuit clothing, which was much more comfortable and better suited, and every man was skilled in what he was doing, and they were all multi-skilled. They all knew exactly what the task was. He was taking 19 men, whereas Scott was taking 65 men, and Scott would have to provide rations for those 65 men. The Fram eventually made it down to Antarctica until the Ross Ice Barrier. And Amundsen set up his headquarters at the Bay of Whales on the Ross Ice Shelf, whereas Scott was over at McMurdo Sound. Now, Amundsen was so prepared for this. This preparation was so well organised that his men had prepared prefabricated hut. So within 6 days of arriving in Antarctica, they had already set up his carpenters had already set up their hut, which they named Framheim. And the 19 men would stay in that hut for the winter. Scott, on the other hand, got down there and said, "We need to build a hut." And they took more than 6 weeks to build a hut for those 65 men. And the rest of the time, they spent the time on the ship travelling backwards and forwards. And that hut was segregated into officers' quarters and enlisted men's quarters as well. Amundsen decided he would set up food depots all the way along in February 1911, and these food depots were going to be at 80, 81 and 82 degrees south. Now, these food depots were going to be huge depots full of food and fuel for their cooking equipment, and would have a large flag on. There'd be like an igloo type thing. And then every 100 metres to the left and to the right of these food depots, he set up little igloos with flags on it. And those flags had numbers. And all of these, which were 100 metres apart, were connected by ropes. He knew that if he was coming back, he might be coming back in a blizzard. He might miss the food depot, but he would surely come across one of these other markers. He would be able to read the number on the flag and know exactly which way to turn to get to his food depot. His preparation was absolutely precise. Now, this was also a good test of the dogs and the skis, and it worked magnificently because they were able to cover 30 nautical miles every day. They could have gone further, but Amundsen said, no, we don't want to overwork the dogs. We won't go any more than 30 nautical miles a day. In the meantime, Scott was using his tractors and his ponies. One tractor fell through the ice and sunk. The other tractors wouldn't work. The oil that they'd bought wasn't thick enough for the machinery in those sorts of climates. And on the very first supply run to set up a supply base, 6 of the 8 ponies died, and only 2 were left. Scott and his men had to man-haul their sled, and they were only able to make a maximum of 12 nautical miles a day on their very best day. And when they'd finished each day, they were absolutely exhausted. So when they set up their supply depot, they set it up 30 nautical miles short of where they originally intended it for it to be, and that would cause a disaster later on. They all settled back into their huts for the winter because they couldn't travel in winter. They spent months in those huts. And then on the 19th of October 1911, Amundsen set off with 5 men, 4 sledges, 52 dogs. He took a lot more dogs than he needed. He didn't know what would... he was travelling over new territory, whereas Scott was going over territory that Shackleton had gone. He knew the route. But Amundsen didn't know how many dogs he would lose. They eventually made it up to the glacier, up to the top there, and they started destroying some of these dogs and feeding it to the other dogs. And eventually they got down to 18 dogs. Now the men would later say that these dogs, destroying these dogs was the hardest part of the whole ordeal. They'd spent all this time on the ship with these dogs and all the winter spent with them as well, and they became great companions to them. They reached the South Pole on the 14th of December 1911. The 5 great Norwegians here, they set up a tent and planted the Norwegian flag. And they spent 3 days there making sure that they had exactly the right position. They would ski out and take navigational readings to make sure they were exactly at the South Pole. Amundsen wrote a letter for Scott and left it inside the tent. And that letter was basically, would you mind delivering this other letter to the King of Norway in case we don't survive the trip back? And then they started their return. In the meantime, Scott was still more than 100 miles away. He had 16 men with him that he had to feed along this way. And now he decided that he would make a dash for the pole. But he once again made a very strange decision. Instead of taking the 4 men for the polar assault team that they originally planned to do, he decided to take 5, which was a very unusual, very unpopular decision amongst his men because they only were able to take rations for 4 men. And once again, this would prove a disaster. When they were on the 15th of January 1912, when they were still 20 miles away from the South Pole, Scott looked through binoculars and saw an object in the distance. And 2 days later, they reached that object. It was Amundsen's tent at the South Pole. They had arrived there 34 days after the Norwegians. Now, they were absolutely exhausted, but now they were also emotionally devastated as well. They weren't the first ones to reach the South Pole, and you can probably see the despair in Scott's face here. But they're also suffering from scurvy, snow blindness, and frostbite as well. They were in very, very poor condition. But once again, Scott made an unusual decision. On the way back, they collected another 14 kilograms of rock samples, scientific samples. Then if you were trying to just save yourselves and get back to civilization, why would you would have jettisoned all the equipment, all the scientific, all the rocks that you'd brought along the way and just try and survive. But they didn't. They took these rocks with them, and actually later on they'd become handy for scientists. But they all perished along the way, obviously. Only 11 miles from where their food depot was, which, as I said before, was set 30 miles short of where they originally intended to have it. So it wasn't a well-organised expedition as well. These are the two routes that the men took. As I say, the route that Scott took most of it had been already been mapped out by Shackleton, but the route that Amundsen took was over new territory. And not many people realise that the South Pole, is 2,830 metres above sea level, or 9,300 feet. So man-hauling these sleds or driving these dog sleds, most of the way there is uphill, an incredible distance. That's about more than a third of the way up Mount Everest. So it's a big climb. Amundsen reached Framheim Base on the 26th of January 1912, and he was 9 days ahead of schedule. He had all 18 dogs were there in very good condition. In fact, every dog and every man had actually put on weight during this on this expedition. They travelled 3,500 kilometres in just 99 days. And as I say, they'd all put on weight. They sailed for Hobart, Australia, where they sent telegrams to inform the world of what they had achieved. And once again, they became heroes all the way around the world, but especially back in Norway, where they received a magnificent reception upon their arrival. To raise money to pay off some of the debts of this expedition, Amundsen went on speaking engagements, giving lectures, and he was actually in the United States giving lectures when he found out the fate of Scott and his men 12 months later. He then wanted to become the first person to fly to the North Pole, so he retained his pilot's license, and he managed to raise money for 2 planes. And they decided to fire these 2 planes over the North Pole. They set off and they got up to where 88 degrees north, only 120 nautical miles away from the North Pole. But one of the planes crashed there. Amundsen landed the other plane nearby, but now they were stuck on the ice. They were there for more than a month on very restricted rations, hardly any food at all, and they had to try and make a runway for the remaining plane to be able to take off. They had to move 600 tons of ice during this time, as I say, with very restricted rations. But eventually they were able to cram into the remaining plane that was serviceable, and they were able to take off by the skin of their teeth. They'd been given up for dead, and once again, when he arrived, he'd returned from the dead, and he was another hero again in Norway. And then he decided to fly a hot air balloon, dirigible, over the North Pole. This was an Italian-designed airship with an Italian captain, and they were able to achieve this on the 12th of May 1926. And this is a trip from Norway to Alaska, which only took 72 hours to complete, and he became the first fully verified person to reach the North Pole, and of course the first man to reach the North Pole and the South Pole. And after that, he thought that's enough, and he retired from his exploration days. But when the captain of that Italian airship went missing on another expedition, Amundsen decided to use his plane to go and search for his friend. And unfortunately, he disappeared on the 18th of June, 1928. The only part of the plane that was ever found was one of the floats from the plane. Amundsen's body itself was never found. He is a national hero here in Norway. You'll see evidence of him everywhere you go. We've got Amundsen gin and things on board here. If you ever get the chance to go to the Fram Museum in Oslo, it was set up in 1936, magnificent museum. Inside you'll find the Joa and lots of other things that they'd taken on his expeditions. The Joa was returned from San Francisco in 1972, and it's inside the museum there now. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of Norway's greatest explorer. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your cruise. You've certainly brought the weather with you, and I'll see you around the ship. Thank you very much.